I'm Eileen Galuli, and it's my pleasure as the Executive Director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University to welcome you to The Wire, the conference. It's a two-day exploration of the rich, generative afterlife of the eponymous HBO series that's been crucial, I think, in transforming public perception of television as a medium of pop culture to an aesthetic genre meriting scholarly inquiry. In just a minute, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to my colleague Marcellus Blount, who'll be chairing the first panel on Teaching the Wire. But I want to say a few words about the genesis of this unusually wide-ranging, public-facing, community-engaging, highly collaborative conference. As some of you know, I actually don't watch television, and it's not on principle, but simply because I got out of the habit of doing so when I was in graduate school and I had small children and I was looking for more hours in the day. I actually aspire to watch TV in retirement. I've never seen an episode of The Simpsons, for example, and I had never heard Hillary Clinton speak until 2008. But when the 10th colleague questioned me about how I could possibly teach Victorian novels and not have seen The Wire, because it was all about seriality, as our second panel today will be discussing, I decided to make it my summer reading 2 years ago. And I instantly became a convert and a proselytizer. And it turned out that whenever I mentioned to anyone on campus that I wanted to do a conference on The Wire, they would immediately light up and offer to put me in touch with some of the creators of the show or offer to organize a panel, which is how this two-day Wire Fest came to be. There are many people to thank, including all of the speakers listed by name in your programs, but I would particularly like to thank the School of Journalism, and especially June Cross, the Institute for Research on African American Studies, and especially Marcellus Blount and Yosef Surratt, the Film Division of the School of the Arts, and especially Jane Gaines and Rob King, the Center for Justice at Columbia University, and especially Cheryl Wilkins and Carla Shedd. I also want to thank the extremely hardworking staff of the Heyman Center for the Humanities, and especially Jonah Cardillo and Conley Lowrance. But most of all, I want to thank Shawana Wright, without whose creativity, perseverance, warmth, and fortitude, this event would not have been possible. So, thank you, and Marcellus.
Well, thank you for coming. This is early on a Friday morning, and I know more of you will join us. But thank you for coming out so early and listening to us talk about The Wire, which I think as a text is extraordinarily important. And today's panel is about teaching The Wire, or living The Wire and teaching The Wire. I can recall when presidential candidate Barack Obama mentioned in an interview that his favorite television program was The Wire. And I thought, okay, this is getting interesting. But it got even more interesting when he said that the character, Omar Little, was his favorite character. Characteristically, Obama paused to suggest that he wasn't necessarily in favor of the politics of the show. But Omar Little embodies the ethos, I think, of The Wire, this robbing hood, notorious, feared, and beautifully developed. I got the shotgun, you got the briefcase. It's all in the game, though, right? The second season, the episode All Prologue, gives us the statement of the ways in which the society represented in the post-industrial city of Baltimore represents a moral code. And indeed, that moral code is various. And I begin with the character of Omar Little only because he's as various a character as we get on the show, but as various a character as we've seen in American television. And so I say yes to President Obama for recognizing how important he is. Living the wire, teaching the wire. I grew up in New York City, and communities like those represented in the wire. I myself was not a participant, for example, in the drug trade, although, as Faulkner would say, I heard the echo, but not the shot. And one of the things that for me personally, in my teaching of the wire that's been so important, is that I do see myself in my experience reflected back, but not through the lens of a replication of reality, but rather through the lens of an imaginative reconstruction, and indeed the wire as a narrative experiment exceeds the expectations of social realism, and I would argue is a kind of moral allegory. And when I teach the wire, if I can wax autobiographical for a moment, I teach the wire in a course on Black masculinities, an undergraduate course here at Columbia in the English department, the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and the Institute for Research in African American Studies. This course, which I advertised as ending with the wire, was vastly oversubscribed. But I wanted to end the course of 16 brilliant students with a discussion of several episodes of The Wire. And in the course on Black masculinities, I wanted them to see as represented a range of diverse Black men. And that's one of the things, although they're Black and white characters to be sure, characters from a range of occupations, part of the beauty of The Wire has to do with character development and the ways in which there's such a diverse cast. And I mean that not just in terms of the characters, but also the moral development, the symbolic realism, if I can construct that term. And so my students, some of whom had not seen The Wire, seeing it for the first time, were absolutely enthralled. And I said, look, it's at the end of the semester. You can binge over the vacation. And I think some of them actually did. And then for some students, they were returning to what had been their viewing experience of The Wire. Initially, the viewership for The Wire was actually relatively low, although these visual texts have a profound afterlife. And my students, for example, said that, I shouldn't say this, they were able to download episodes. And I said, don't tell me about that because I don't know what you're doing. But this show has had an afterlife which makes it possible to teach The Wire, to teach it variously. There are wonderful clips on YouTube, for example, and scholarship that's been published that I think makes The Wire easily accessible as a narrative experiment. And I keep coming back to these literary terms because I do think it's a fascinating text. And Dr. Andrew Moore's wonderful piece, teaching HBO's The Wire. Dr. Moore is at the St. Thomas University. He talks about the ways in which, first appearing in 1902, The Wire has been called the best show on television, and of course that's true. That the show emphasizes poverty, racial discrimination, and institutional collapse, but that the show's creator, David Simon, claims that it's about the other America, the nation of people victimized by the logic of post-industrial capitalism and forgotten by their more affluent neighbors in the upper class. And so at Harvard, for example, there is a wonderful course taught about the ways in which the wire represents urban inequality. It's pretty amazing, this course taught by an esteemed scholar of racial and economic inequality, and that's William Julius Wilson. And I know among our panelists, we teach the wire, we teach it variously for a range of things. And I want to introduce the speakers of this panel. I'm really fascinated by the range of presentations, so I think it's sort of fitting for this session on, as I suggest, teaching the wire, but also living the wire. Our first presenter is Professor of English at Rutgers University-Newark, Frances Bartkowski. She is currently the chairperson, yes, of English at Rutgers Newark, has published variously Feminist Utopias, Travelers, Immigrants, Inmates, Essays in Estrangement. And it's actually amazing, right? And she has been the director of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers Newark, and she teaches students in the graduate program in American Studies and is affiliated with African American and African Studies. Our second panelist is Professor Sherri-Ann Butterfield, who is the Senior Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Associate Professor of Psychology at Rutgers University-Newark. And we have colleagues from the same institution who we're experimenting with modes of presentation, and we have a joint presentation. Dr. Butterfield is a member of the graduate school faculty, and her interests include immigration, race and ethnic relations, identity development and culture, and I know the work in terms of the experience of the scholarship about the experience of Afro-Caribbeans, and so I think that's a very interesting perspective in thinking about racial diversity as a way of locating, again, the range of representations in the wire, who is included, and then also who is excluded. Our next presenter is Toby Gordon, who is Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins University. And having joined the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School in 2010, is an associate professor with expertise in the areas of healthcare policy, management of hospitals and health systems, and technology commercialization. Her various associations to the academy and the world beyond suggest to us that this will be a fascinating presentation. Our final speaker is Arvind Rajagopal, who is Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University, that university that's somewhere on this island of Manhattan, I'm told. And he's a faculty member in the departments of sociology and then the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. His books include Politics After Television the Indian public sphere, and there's a range of cultural studies in his scholarship. I hope we hear some of that in the panel discussion today. We will be informal. The panelists will speak for a total of no more than 60 minutes, and that leaves us a great deal of time for discussion. So as they're presenting their material, write down your questions, and we will open the floor to questions and comments and provocations and anything that you'd like to talk about. So we'll begin.
So good morning. Again, Sherri-Ann Butterfield. And so this is a co-presentation with my colleague, Fran Bartkowski, and this is actually modeled after how we actually teach the class. We co-teach our class on the Wire together, which presents all sorts of issues that we're going to talk about in terms of, one, co-teaching a course, but also co-teaching a course with an English professor and a sociologist, right? And so the ways in which we approach the material and the classroom. So, you know, I find it interesting that when people talk about the Wire, one of the things we start off with is, how did we come to this space? How did the Wire capture us? And as a sociologist, when the Wire had just started season 1, I had refused to watch. I said, I'm all good. I study race and masculinity for a living. I'm tired of seeing sort of the criminality of black men. I'm good. And so I had a colleague from a different institution who called and said, what kind of self-respecting sociologist are you not to watch? And then you attack my core, and I got offended. And so I watched in real time and caught from episode 3 on. And so when we talk about that there wasn't a whole lot of viewership, not so much, but in popular culture, there was quite a bit. I'm also a sports fan, and there were sports writers every Sunday after a football game relating the Wire to what was happening either on the field or off, which I found fascinating. And so when I saw that, and I would keep up with this, I said, this is something that should be a class. And then I ended up having a conversation with my colleague here, and it was really Fran's brilliant idea for us to co-teach this class. And really in the ways in which we come at it was sort of what Marcellus talked about in terms of thinking about urban inequality, class, bureaucracy, conflict in the workplace, social institutions, notions and positions of power, and personality and interpersonal relations, both at neighborhood prisons and at work. And it was just fascinating. We thought, how could you not want to teach a course on these issues? How could you not want to teach a course that gives you the visual, that visually encompasses everything that we want our students to take away from college, whether they be undergrads or graduate students? And so that was our starting point, and then thinking about how this was actually going to play out was also a challenge. And so we're actually going to do an interplay of both of us going back and forth. And so
coming at this as, teacher and scholar of narrative in a variety of ways, I'll just say that for me, yes, I had begun watching some long-form TV, The Sopranos, for example, and a colleague of mine from a former French department I was part of said, oh, you've got to see this show, The Wire, you've just got to see this. And I think he was about 3 episodes in, and he said, you might want to try the subtitles on for starters, okay? And so I began watching, and I think by the time season 4 or 5 was on, Sherri-Ann and I are colleagues and friends, and we were watching the broadcast version of this in its last moments. And the pleasure of the text that we had between us in talking about it, and, as you say, teaching the Wire, living the Wire, I mean, not from the inside, but it becomes part of your daily stream when you're that invested and involved in it. And, we had this notion about teaching it together, and that wasn't really very much part of the pedagogical culture at Rutgers Newark. But when we presented that to people in our departments who needed to say yes to this, there was kind of immediate uptake, and realized we could just kind of institutionally put together 2 rosters of students, giving us a class of 100. So some took it for credit in sociology and some for English, and they came from across the map of majors and minors and disciplines. And that's been interesting, because we did it first in the fall of 2013, and we're doing it again now. When we did it in 2013, the title we gave the class was Street Stories, HBO's The Wire. This time, the course is called Black Lives Matter. And that's really changed the outside readings and the kinds of, the sort of focus of the discussion. So, what's the same is that all 5 seasons are the primary text for the course. And in a 14-week semester, we can get through that. So we have 3 more weeks left. They'll be about season 5. And the outside frame 2.5 years ago were some journalistic essays about The Wire, some bloggers. Critical Inquiry and Film Quarterly had just done special issues. So that was about as academic as it got on The Wire per se, but we also, put some Foucault in there, some Fanon, and some of that has stayed and some of that has changed.
And so I think one of the challenges that we have when we change the sort of focus is that the first time we taught it, we spent a lot of time wanting them to concentrate on the visual text, as it were. And when we change it to a Black Lives Matter, it becomes, not that the visual becomes less important, but we've spent less time on it because we and some more so the students, I think, are really consumed with conversations and dialogue and discussions about bodies and what it means to have bodies on the ground and bodies in their reading, the movement of bodies. And so really thinking about how changing the approach has changed how we teach The Wire. And really thinking about how do you then assign a paper on this for this course, right? What are the things that you think about? And so assignments range from anything looking at character development to how the different. So when we looked, so the first assignment was thinking about.
Thematic aspects of the show.
Right.
So chain of command, masculinities, loss, disappearance of work and, those kinds of issues. And then.
And these are not easy issues for our students, particularly when they come from varying perspectives. And so you do have the students who are sociology majors or English majors, but we also have business school students as well who do supply chain management, and they find this completely relevant to their work. And they're like, this is great, right? Or our accounting majors. We have a lot of criminal justice majors, which also makes sense. In thinking about how they can apply this. But it is also a challenge. We find often that this is the first time that students have been asked to use a visual medium as their text. And so when we have conversations about assignments, say, well, if it's a book, I can go back to page blah, blah, blah for my quote. And we said, well, yeah, that's what the fast forward and the rewind button is for, But really also finding pedagogically that this is a challenge and an exciting challenge to think about what are the things that our students are focused on, even as a visual generation, I find very interesting. And sort of what are the things that they're looking for? And then what are the things that we focus on? And so sometimes they get frustrated because we show clips, you can't do a whole episode in class, and we'll show clips and they're like, well, why did you pick that one and not this one? This one, but it's The Wire. Every scene is amazing because it all makes sense. It all hangs together, in these great ways. And so really thinking about what are the pieces we want them to focus on and why. And we'll talk about, the difference in light from season 2, for example, that seems much more brighter than season 1 or season 3. Those kinds of things come up, but it is really, it gets really interesting.
Yeah. Our class is a 3-hour block, so we can, and on occasion we do, screen whole episodes and then discuss. So we do that with the pilot episode, for example. Or the other one that we've typically done is the penultimate episode of season 3 with the death of Stringer Bell, an award-winning episode and just a kind of great climax to a number of stories within the story. And cinematically just sort of gorgeous and quoted by others, visual texts all the time, I think. Yeah, so their fields of study this time around, majority of criminal justice majors, and there's a school of criminal justice on our campus, so that makes sense, but it's what brings them to The Wire, and a number of them are planning to go into law enforcement. So that raises all kinds of issues, and you may or may not know that our campus for many years now is the most diverse in the country. So that raises very interesting issues around questions about how Black lives matter and how they matter in the wire, given that the Black lives are often the lives of law enforcement officers as well as the lives of victims and actors in the various fields and occupations that each season takes on. So I said before that our outside readings change. So this time around we have, the opportunity to use passages, chapters from the New Jim Crow. Ta-Nehisi Coates, right, kind of comes along at a very important moment, especially given his biography as a son of Baltimore, and the form of that text as a message to his son. So that's, plus the many, many wonderful articles in the New Yorker and the Atlantic by the likes of Jelani Cobb and others about Black Lives Matter that we've been able to bring to them, very sort of fresh and hot off the press, if you will. So that seems, worth noting as a way of taking on the entire 5 seasons as a primary text, and where do we go for the outside materials that we ask them to take in, to master, and then to write about in their papers along the way. So the bodies in space and place, I think that's really one of the issues that we want to get to in terms of how this show asks us to think about collectivity, about subjectivity, about individuals in their communities, and how well-placed they are, how transitionally, how vulnerably located they are as bodies in space and place.
Mm-hmm. And the importance of bodies in space and place for us are also about the bodies that they're looking at the front of the room, right? So if we stood up, it gets even worse in terms of height differentials, we have generational, and so one of the things that actually amuses us quite a bit is when students walk in and like, oh, what's going on here, right? And thinking about our own perspectives and from whence we come, where our own backgrounds and what brings us to this place. And just to also reiterate what Fran said about the diversity of our students, we're the most diverse campus, and I would argue that our diversity is actually more religious than, as well as racial and ethnic. Mm-hmm. And so we have quite a few Muslim students in our class, and they help us talk about what's not in the wire in terms of thinking about particularly how is Islam presented or not, and why is Brother Muzone the only, those things come up. But it also presents a challenge when you have that kind of religious diversity about showing the show, period, right? It's not an easy show to watch for lots of reasons. And so we find ourselves doing disclaimers at the beginning, right? That this is intense, we expect this is an academic exercise, and we expect you to engage in it as such. And the students are in, and some of them will talk to us about, if my parents knew I was watching this would be a serious problem, right? But they also understand the importance of them being in the space, because we're also sitting at our institution, sitting in the city of Newark, that for in almost every way looks like what happens in Baltimore in terms of we have a port, we have all these, loss of work in lots of places, and trying to rebuild the city. And I think our mayor is working very hard on that, but really finding the students see themselves in this, both with their hometown, but also where they go to school. And thinking about, well, what else can they do? If these are the things that the city of Baltimore is grappling with, how do we grapple with that in the city of Newark? And that's and it's, in lots of ways, which I think the actors will talk about tomorrow, it spurs them to do other kinds of things. What kind of philanthropic things can they do? What kind of nonprofits can they create? And they actually have an exercise this semester where they have an experiential philanthropy part of the course where they are to identify nonprofits that we're going to donate funds to as a class. And so them doing research on who's the more deserving, and that's a really tough thing to have. We know that there are lots of nonprofits everywhere, and so they find themselves well, these are the issues that The Wire shows, which one of these issues do we want to take up with a particular nonprofit? And it's been really exciting. We'll see what they come up with in a couple of weeks, but it's just been.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as Sherri-Ann is saying, in some ways our students are both an ideal audience for The Wire, and yet, as she's also pointed out, they're a kind of sheltered audience. There they are in Newark for their classes, but many of them are getting in their cars and going home to other New Jersey urban locations or suburban locations. And there's really a very new emphasis at the university in the last couple of years about being more engaged in the city where we all come to work and study. And this experiential philanthropy piece, it's going to be very interesting because the very last day of class, they'll be presenting which of the organizations they've discovered they feel is the most worthy of these funds that a professor in another part of the university got and distributed to 4 different classes to give money to nonprofits. And, you know, part of our satisfaction in getting to do this the first time around is that that's the success of that course, the word going out about that course, and a kind of backed by popular demand, when are you going to get to do this again? When will our students get to take this class again? Has generated a kind of culture of team teaching that really wasn't there before. And I think people saw both how easy it was to do institutionally, bureaucratically, and how successful it was for students to be exposed to professors coming from disciplines as different as sociology and literature. And there are now a couple of very serious initiatives on campus that are driven by the wish to have more team teaching going on for our students. I think that's really worth saying. And we can see how The Wire is an ideal kind of text for doing this. But I think if you open your thinking up, there are lots of other kinds of disciplines that could come together in ways that really give students a way of thinking across majors. And, you know, this is an interdisciplinary world. No major is quite sufficient for really putting together the way knowledge is produced these days, which, you know, demands that people talk across their divisions and silos and differences.
And also, I mean, I want to go back to something Fran said earlier about given who's in the room. So not only do we have students who are interested in the criminal justice system and going to engage in one way or the other, we also have officers in the room who've yet to identify themselves to their classmates. And it for obvious reasons for them, and they're like, don't tell anybody.
I still don't know who they are, actually.
Yeah, you don't know.
She does, I don't.
So, and so part of them is they acknowledge the issues are real. They know it plays out in their own precincts, for a lack of a better term. And they said, but this helps me be a better police officer, right? And there are some for whom had taken our class the first time we taught and said, I still went into law enforcement, and I feel like I also was armed with more information than I would have before watching the show. And I think that's really important I mean, you know, that's not something people think about when we talk about The Wire, about how I'm going to be a better cop as a result of The Wire. That doesn't quite come up. But thinking about being able, and they say it's about visually seeing how these things play out, how Prez Belusky can go from taking a student's eye out to becoming an effective teacher, right? That sort of transformation. And they want to be able to experience that for themselves. And so when we have these conversations, one of the things that we constantly remind them of that's so great about The Wire, that because it's a text, because it's a long form text, because it's playing the characters out over several seasons, no one is situated in a box. That there are the multiplicities of all of us, and we need to be able to acknowledge that. And it's not an easy conversation, particularly around a Black Lives Matter movement, when you want to problematize the police. And so we have really hard and long conversations. A couple of weeks ago, we went on for a while about privilege. And to talk about privilege when the majority of the class are Black and brown bodies is very, very difficult. even in the of a college setting, because the conversation is really about, I may be privileged in this space, but when I walk out that door, my privilege often walks out with it. And so, and as being, as being educators, where you want to say no, but we know the realities of life, and so having conversation about how you negotiate that privilege and those are the kinds of things that The Wire leads us to do that, frankly, I find, even as a race scholar, only the Wire can do in that particular kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, that in that conversation about privilege, which was driven by their wish to continue talking about this. So, law enforcement officers whom I don't know and can't identify, but in the course, a number of the students in the class happen to be, older, non-traditional college-age men of color. And, in the course of this discussion, one of those men came out as formerly incarcerated, right? I mean, these are the kinds of moments that a class like this and a text like this enables, permits, invites, or, disrupts. I think for a lot of the more traditional age students in the classroom, that's a kind of shocking moment to hear that from someone who's in the room with them and who they've been listening to for the last 10 weeks. Say one thing or another. Suddenly they hear him in a whole, and so do we, right? So the way that the text itself, of course, as we all know, and that's what brings us here, is so moving. Teaching it really moves you to places that are, for us, completely unexpected at moments like that. Just to say a bit more about how the focus on Black Lives Matter led us to the kinds of things we've been saying and led us also away from some of the kinds of aesthetic questions that we were taking up in a more focused way 2.5 years ago, to talk about the cinematic issues, to talk about the way to understand what's going on a screen that has been framed as deliberately as Simon and his collaborators have done so. Those sorts of aesthetic questions have kind of taken a back seat a bit this semester because the social issues, the political issues, we're living this presidential campaign, the economic inequality issues are so front and center that it has felt very compelling to stay with those things and really give that space in the classroom.
And sort of, I know we have to wrap up, but one of the things that we love about, well, there are lots of things we love about The Wire, but what works from teaching in 2013, 2016 is it doesn't feel dated, right? Even though the technology has moved on in terms of surveillance, and we can go into that later, watching the show with our students, at no point did any of them say, oh, well, I can't believe they were still using pagers, or, there were still public payphones, at least in season 1, and really thinking about how The Wire is a text that, aside from it just being something we can all access, but something that will live on and can be taught at any given point. Hopefully we figure out some of the more, the troubling social issues, but really about how it is a living, breathing document in the same way that Foucault does, right, in the history of sexuality. And really trying to also encourage colleagues to think about teaching the visual text more. And I freely admit that as a sociologist, it was a little harder for me than I think it was. Our friend, I'm like, seriously, we need a reading. I need more readings. Like, this is just, we're just watching TV and, thinking about how as academics, it was great because it forced us to stretch ourselves. And I think those of us who've been doing this for a while need challenges. And the show is challenging, the concepts are challenging, but also the mode in which we educate folks forces us to challenge ourselves too. And that's what brings me such joy about this.
Yeah. And I think, the thematics of watching and surveillance, you could do the whole course with that as the guiding principle because it's about caring for each other as much as it is being surveilled, right? I think we'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's important to think about The Wire as a text that generates interdisciplinary study but also pedagogical innovation. Thank you. Professor Gordon?
Is this the clicker? Thanks. Hi, everybody. Really excited to be here. I'm going to tell you about a course I teach at the business school at Johns Hopkins, which is very, very different from an English and sociology orientation. Speak up louder, let me raise the mic. Can everybody hear me? So just by way of background, I'm from Baltimore. I went to the Baltimore City Public Schools. I went away to college. My husband says that doesn't count. I ended up back at Hopkins for grad school, and I've been there ever since. So I'm here to to answer any questions you have about Baltimore and what happened. I don't know if there's anyone else from Baltimore in the audience, so you'll have to take my word for it. Okay, so as I said, I teach in a business school, and I'm responsible for the healthcare management studies. I've been at Hopkins for a really long time, and I look at everything and I just see healthcare issues. When my students look at The Wire, they love seeing Stringer Bell in class studying macroeconomics. They loved when he talked about elasticity of demand in the copier shop. And they really love when he talks about product, and they relate that to marketing. So we began having conversations when our school launched as a full-time school, and we were able, students could get together with a professor and create a new course. So that's what we did 5 years ago. And so I've been teaching this course for 5 years, and I'm going to tell you sort of what we cover and how we match it to the seasons, and then show you some of the products the students have created. We cover season, it's an 8-week course, 3 hours a week. The students are full-time, part-time, they're very international, people from Baltimore, people from all over, so it's a very, very mixed group. In weeks 1 and 2, what we really focus on are looking at the health issues that you can see when you watch The Wire. And so after we watch that season, others are looking at these narrative aspects, and I'm looking at what are all the healthcare issues you see. So we do a big brainstorming and end up putting on the blackboard all the health issues people see, and I've categorized them by major topics here: trauma, psychological and psychiatric conditions, nutrition, environmental exposure, and chronic conditions secondary to stress and to lack of access to care in Baltimore. I then take, every year the list is pretty much the same, I add to it if it grows, and then I teach the social determinants of health framework from the World Health Organization, and basically all the issues that were on the blackboard previously match up to this framework. And so we go through this framework and students understand what that is. So again, these are people studying healthcare management in a business school. Now, what's really interesting is the issues that we could see in The Wire from 2002 to 2007, they really haven't changed. If anything, they've probably gotten worse. I'm going to show you just a couple of the health indicators in Baltimore. And this came out of a recent City Health Department report. So we have a higher mortality rate than the rest of the state, worse poverty and unemployment than the rest of the state, underperforming schools, a high percent of kids with adverse childhood experiences, and you can begin to see just from the visuals how this all matches up. Some serious morbidity or disease aspects. City ranks last on key health outcomes in Maryland: smoking, asthma, obesity, et cetera. And then, of course, addictions, which sort of the addiction rate runs concurrently with HIV. So 60,000 addicts in the city, addicted mothers, more than double the national average for low birth weight babies from the addicted mothers. And we're one of the top, this is our claim to fame, one of the top 5 cities worldwide for HIV infection, which is highly correlated with drug use. We also have access to care issues. We have some of the best healthcare institutions in the country, and we have this amazing sort of first of its kind trauma system, which has probably gotten great because they get a lot of gunshot wounds to treat, among other things. But most of the money in Baltimore is spent on the acute care hospital side, not so much on the prevention and community-based services. And literally in the backyard of the major teaching hospitals in the city, you could find the pit. Okay, so So now we've gotten through season 1, we've learned this framework, and the students have an assignment, and they have to come up with an innovative solution to a health problem depicted in The Wire that they're inspired by The Wire. Then they have to come up with a business proposal for how to create their novel innovation. And then I said, I'm really tired of PowerPoint presentations, make a movie, which has turned into kind of a cool thing because using a visual text and having students actually learn that there are other types of communication in the business world that they should know how to do. Now, we then proceed while they're working on many assignments related to the production of the video. Season 2, we cover in the 3rd week, and we do the economic history of Baltimore, political economy. There's lots of great readings related to the tourism and real estate development. You see Stringer Bell heavily into that. In weeks 4 and 5, I cover how you develop a new program planning, logic models, how do you plan for the evaluation of your results, very typical things you would do in forming a nonprofit. And about once a week I say, we're in business school, we have to talk about business, and then we go back to discussions, and we have lots of guest speakers and great conversations. And then in week 6, I do a session on Nonprofits 101 and funding, and how do you actually get funding, and we're fortunate, we have the Casey Foundation, headquartered in Baltimore. We have OSI, so there's a lot of outside help people that will come in and help the students. And then in week 7 of the 8 weeks, we have the film festival. And I just did a quick summary of the topics in general that the movies cover, and about 40% are programs for youth services, after-school programs, sports programs, and so on. And there's a mix. Employment, food, and food deserts has been a really popular topic. And one student actually launched a startup of like a city farming kind of program after he said his project in this class, but I know in fact he did it in every class. And you can get the idea of the types of things. This year, the kind of front runner's been heroin and drug abuse and naloxone. I've had students do journaling or homework assignments or discussion boards online. This is page from a journal of a student who's actually a trauma surgeon from Australia. He's getting his master's in public health and in business, and every page of his journal had these amazing illustrations. And the list on the right just gives you an idea of the topics that were the movie titles that were covered. I actually think there's an alumni of the course in the audience here who I just noticed, which is really cool, from the first year. So you really helped make this happen. I want to show you a quick little video that came out of one of the teams. Wait a minute. They made these with their cell phones. This is not sophisticated movie making, but you'll get the idea, I think. students are pretty amazing. I learned more about the making of that video several years later, and riding around filming. I'm sure there are a lot of, we're trying to cover more about filmmaking in class and things like that. But so this is week 7. We have this film festival. It's very exciting. I bought a red carpet this year. And then in week 8, we have a debriefing. And basically, I bring in a community artist for this session. He's done, if anyone's been in Baltimore, the big mural on the health care for the homeless building, among other things. And the students work in mixed groups, not their movie team, and they brainstorm the changes that they want to see in Baltimore. They write that down. Then we give them a drawing lesson, they draw their ideas, and then they paint them. Then the paintings dry, they cut them up, and you see them here cutting them up. And then each team makes a collage on a big whiteboard. So I'm going to show you, this is one of the collages. So like the houses at the top on the right are black and white inside of the older dilapidated ones. And then there's a gradation as it goes across the left where they become colorful and there's activity and people. So a lot of really interesting themes presented here. And then each team writes a little summary or story about it. So I'm going to end, I'll just quickly show you some of the murals that are pretty amazing. Fran had asked, did graduate students like doing this? But they really got into it, and it really does kind of bring things together, because there's so many serious, really dark issues that we grapple with, especially looking at all the healthcare problems. So this ends up being kind of their positive, upbeat ending. And they're just phenomenal. And they're all in my office, and you can see all the sort of pasted on pieces of paper, but when you take pictures of them, they're just amazing. So I print things with them, and I actually made some new business cards with these pictures on them. And that's essentially it. So obviously I'm grateful to The Wire for this chance to teach business skills in a really meaningful way, because they're just critical to work with community organizations. And I don't need to go into all the reasons, but you have to have a sustainable program. And then of course the Wire alumni, and I'm thrilled that one of them has surprised me with a visit here today. We've had about 120 students to date, and then Jay Wolf, Schlossberg Cohen, the community artist that helps, and many, many guest speakers that come and help. So it's great, I love it, and appreciate your interest. Thank you.
And our final presenter from that place down in Lower Manhattan.
You know where it is. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Eileen, for inviting me, and Marcellus for that provocative introduction. I think a thread running through these presentations could be used as the title of my talk, which is What Teaching the Wire Taught Me. The social fact of race has long challenged efforts at readings that seek to distance image from reality. It has also challenged attempts to analyze visual texts as if they were historical documents of record. David Simon has claimed that the stories in The Wire are or could be true. They derive from reportage. And The Wire has been adopted as a teaching text, as we can see in many classes. But it is first and foremost something designed to make audiences watch and to keep them watching, as several distinguished scholars here have observed. Hence, we can't treat it as a history lesson where it's judged for its accuracy and comprehensiveness. For me, the question rather is how to think about its politics and aesthetics together with its relationship to history, and that is my question today. As someone whose disciplinary training is in sociology, I'm interested in how the social is constituted and reproduced, and I think The Wire presents compelling questions in this regard. I suggest we can understand The Wire as one of two things. It can be seen as an artful portrayal of how things are, and what it portrays as a sorry state of affairs. In fact, it is tragic. Simon has often described The Wire as Greek tragedy. This is a point often repeated in commentary on the show, but Simon doesn't specify whether he means the Aristotelian or the Nietzschean view of tragedy. That is, whether he would see it as catharsis or as an expression of a strong society that would only be emboldened by reckoning with its own failings. I would call this homeopathic as opposed to cathartic. I think it is clear that Simon is an advocate for the Nietzschean view of tragedy, and that he wants to stimulate the will to confront the problems he presents. This is certainly the message that he urges in the numerous interviews he's given, although it's important to note that such messages are absent in the show as such. Alternatively, this is a second way of viewing The Wire, we could see it as something like a cannibalization of the social, a dismantling and destruction of the possibility of a functioning society, arranged and presented, perhaps to edify the audience, perhaps to arouse it to respond, but certainly to entertain it meanwhile. This would be a reading unintended by Simon, perhaps, but the conditions under which it arises correspond, I think, to the breakdown of the social as we know it, to psychic investments that inhibit the possibility of repair, and cognitive failure indicative of trauma stemming from the violence of race. The cognitive silence of this trauma is reflected in The Wire itself, in its own negotiations, the constraints of the culture industry, and its need to entertain rather than to shock and repel or appall. This is the conclusion I came to on encountering my students' responses when teaching The Wire. So let me speak about teaching The Wire. Being identified as a professor of media studies means that even colleagues with whom you might share esoteric intellectual interests can sidle up to you to confess their secret addictions, which they divulge without qualm. I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer, an eminent historian once told me, solemnly. I had never heard of the show until then, but she did not notice. She couldn't imagine that someone teaching in media studies was not abreast with popular TV shows, like a TV guide come to life. As it happens, the first time I eventually taught the kind of class my colleague imagined I was teaching all the time was quite recently, was on The Wire, of course. Now, in class discussions around segments of the show, students professed enthusiasm for The Wire, but in every attempt I made to contextualize social relations, whether in terms of the civil rights era or Reconstruction, any other relevant period, I found myself drawing a blank. The show might be the first major TV serial which engages so extensively with African American society while trying to avoid being identified as being about race as such. The racial identity of protagonists provides no necessary clue about who is right and who is wrong. The viewer is meant to identify with diverse characters and different sides of the law. In a sense, the serial is about urban futures. It indicates the deep interlocking of race and space as part of its diagnostic about American failure. And if the serial predicates the social on the fact of race, it also enframes race through an ethics that is attentive to racial difference. But in the absence of a political reading, however, or a reading that could be political, or we can discuss it, a range of readings, but ethical behavior as desired by the show can appear to be purely contingent, even random, rather than presenting a key to the problems it manifests. So while I raised the possibility with my students of contextual reading, they had their own politically correct approach. Their idea of being anti-racist was to fall back on practices of civility. Racism was not only not polite, but to speak about race entailed risky speech. And one thing they all learned was to be risk-averse. Therefore, having a conversation about almost any aspect of race proved quite difficult. My response to such intransigence was to introduce extra readings for the class. Yeah? Du Bois, Michelle Alexander, etc., etc. Yeah? What I overlooked was that they could still resist articulating a race-sensitive reading for the class. And it was not until about 9 or 10 weeks into the semester, a 15-week semester, did a chance remark by one student, as it happens of Asian origin, alert me to something I had missed until then. We don't like to say the word black, she she said. No one contradicted her. What about the term African American? That too was a word they did not want to use. What word would they prefer to use to designate this population? Their silence gave me the answer. They did not speak about African Americans. Their discomfort at using any of these terms presumed an attitude of political correctness. No explanation was required when she reported this discomfort. To my mind, one of the remarkable successes of this show is its ability to embed a longer-term history of race as social fact, so much so that the forms of segregation that it depicts, which are themselves virtually invisible in most television shows, can be seen and taken for granted. They neither require explanation, nor do they necessarily provoke indignation. But what I was encountering in retrospect was then one predictable kind of outcome. There were no African Americans in my class, and as in most universities, certainly in elite universities, they are underrepresented at mine. Students could see racial difference at work, but they were not prepared to speak about it, whether it was reacting to the sense of collective guilt and trauma, or because a culture of civility obfuscated the possibility of dialogue, or their own prudence in terms of their careers meant being blind about race. The show's move from rarefied critical circles to popular acclaim took several years, as several of my co-panelists have observed, and the organizers have noted as well. Its high point, of course, was probably the TV interview that Obama did with David Simon in March last year, in the wake of numerous reports that suggested essentially that the killing of African Americans in the United States is a judicially protected activity. This interview occurred of Obama's just a few days ahead of Freddie Gray's murder at the hands of police, subsequent riots in Baltimore in April 2015. Obama's public identification with The Wire affirmed a status he had always sought as political but also cultural avant-garde, and thus above the fray of partisan warfare. And it certainly showed that whatever it was that shaped his policy initiatives on the policing of racial minorities, it was not lack of awareness. But events have led to placing the text in the larger world, not of the culture industry and its genres and formulas, but, much as David Simon proposed in his pitch for the show to HBO, quote, for making statements about the American city and even about the American experiment, unquote. And although the pitch made no reference to racial difference, that is what has proven to be absolutely central. As for the state of racial violence in the US, the prestigious German newspaper Die Zeit recently wrote, the situation of African Americans has barely improved since Martin Luther King, the 48th anniversary of whose assassination was on Monday this week, you may know. And one periodical after Ferguson stated, quote, riots are a necessary part of the evolution of society. This was in Time magazine, of all places. Yeah? If for Jean-Paul Sartre, Marxism was the unsurpassable philosophy of our time, recent events seem to confirm that the question of race remains the unsurpassable problem in the United States, I suggest, to be confronted in any statement of the American experiment. In 1837, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that American society was organized with blacks at the bottom and whites at the top, with other racial groups seeking to distance themselves from blacks and identify with the whites. And the copious accommodation of ethnic non-whites following the 1965 Immigration Act has only layered over that Tocquevillian observation and made it indistinct, but in the process also, I suggest, increased its explosiveness. The forefronting by Obama at a highly charged racial moment in national politics several years after the show ended is usually read as endorsement of the sustained critical approval of the show. But the way in which The Wire deals with questions of race is both empirically rich and theoretically evasive. If the show itself avoids editorial comment, Simon's interviews form a paratext whereas opinions are spelt out quite unambivalently, for the most part. The relationship between the story and the opinions on it is suggested, I think, by the device of surveillance, which provides the title of the show. Now, surveillance arises in a war zone. The corner crews and drug runners, they smash cameras, abandon pagers and cell phones, while the police keep finding new ways to stay on the trail. The title of the show suggests both the partial visibility and the necessary obscurity that the act of surveillance involves, the wiretap being the material edifice around which what we can call police knowledge is built. And strangely, in the show, this police knowledge is often superior to the information that the Baltimore police actually operate with. The data is born in the heat of the battle, but the signal-to-noise ratio, we could say, is astonishingly high. In his pitch to HBO, Simon described surveillance as guaranteeing a unique framing for his police procedural. He also states that the knowledge produced through the surveillance was a double-edged sword, unsettling the authorities who tried to put it to use. If that was the intent of the show, the result is not quite that, in my view. The knowledge produced by the wiretaps is, for the most part, stillborn. It does not lead to discomfort in the corridors of power. In fact, it seldom reaches those corridors, nor does it lead to apprehension of suspects involved all the way up the supply and distribution chain. What it offers is its ethnographic observation and institutional analyses made on the go by one or other actor, which are, of course, narratives without resolution. The perspective of the surveiller is seldom subject to critique. Rather, it is endorsed. This surprisingly under-theorized view of surveillance was recently emphasized in an exchange between Edward Snowden and David Simon on social media, where David Simon dismisses Snowden's concern about mass surveillance by saying there was no evidence that the massive data of government surveillance had been misused. To which Snowden replies, "With all respect, I think this is not a considered view," words to that effect. And indeed it is not. If we take Simon's avoidance of using the race card, which some have applauded and others have criticized, together with his relatively benign view of surveillance, we are justified in asking if there is a problem of racial perspective in The Wire. This is not the usual problem of pitting whites against African Americans, or showing African Americans to be trapped in problems of their own making. Rather, we see a richly delineated black spatial imaginary, but with the participants' own thoughts about racial antagonism, whether to bemoan its existence or to try and overcome it, almost entirely edited out, except in fleeting sequences, where they are likely to merely entertain or provide comic relief rather than build up to an argument and an education. The show thus permits viewers to go away as they came. Now, to change us is not the goal of TV entertainment, nor of The Wire specifically, Simon might argue. But the moral worlds of black and white lives have become separate and disconnected to such an extent, and African Americans have become so structurally marginalized that even when they are made visually intimate with each other, with others in society, and narratively woven together, they can continue to be treated as if they are in a parallel ethical universe. And the unresolved stories indicate, of course, that no easy solution is at hand. There is a catch-22 here. Playing the race card can polarize the audience. Depicting black lives while avoiding the race card wins critical acclaim and a safe berth for endorsements by a US president. We can recall that at the end of his artwork essay, Walter Benjamin wrote, I quote, "Mankind, which in Homer's time was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, is now one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as aesthetic pleasure of the first order, close quote. Without the redemptive possibilities of communist politics, Benjamin argued, technologies of reproduction would only be likely to stage this process of cannibalization, the social. Here, let me step back from this discussion based on the world's most powerful democracy to draw on my own historical knowledge of the world's largest democracy, where we have an older form of hierarchy, which at the same time offers some, I think, illuminating parallels to this conversation. The radical democratic thinker and leader of the former untouchable or Dalit castes, B.R. Ambedkar, observed that the Hindu religion, with its caste system, is a hierarchy of rules without ethical justification. Caste hierarchy is a just-so story. Here is how the world was created, and this is how it will be maintained, with upper castes at the top and outcasts outside. It is a hierarchy invested with ritual sanction and customary belief, lacking any moral reciprocity between these groups. Rather, we have what Ambedkar called a negative sociality, with caste Hindus stigmatizing and marginalizing the so-called untouchables. And it is precisely this sight that is pleasing to the Hindu gods. Positive sociality is prohibited. This system of exclusion has persisted and survived despite nearly 70 years of universal franchise and representative democracy. Although perhaps democracy has added a new wrinkle with Muslims as the new outcasts of Hindu India, while the former untouchables may win a place within it by becoming warriors on behalf of caste Hindus and against Muslims. Now, modern institutions presume a shared ethics by virtue of being society-wide, you could say. The increasingly technological and bureaucratic character of these institutions can result in outcomes that appear either purely contingent or purely coercive, lacking either rationality or morality. The intimacy of television can also heighten our awareness of the impossibility of the social. Perhaps Simon's shows, the greatest gift of that show has been to remind us of this painful fact. Let me end with a quote from James Baldwin, letter to his nephew. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You'd be frightened because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. You, don't be afraid. I said that it was intended that you should perish in the ghetto, perish by never being allowed to go behind the white man's definitions, by never being allowed to spell your proper name. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention, and by a terrible law, a terrible paradox, those innocents who believed that your imprisonment made them safe are losing their grasp of reality. But these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Thank you.
In the time that remains, I would like us to have a discussion of the presentations. I'll say one more thing. Of course, I spent so much time in the introduction that we have a little time now. Contextualization of the wire is extraordinarily important, whether we're looking backward to predecessor texts like James Baldwin, whether we're looking forward to contemporary theorizations about race, whether we're looking at contextualization in terms of the healthcare industry, Black Lives Matter. The point is this: the wire as a mode of engagement suggests that we engage not just the series, but the world around us. If you have questions, and I hope you do, please come up to the mic we have. And we have time for questions and comments, and we really want to hear from you. And the wonderful panelists can answer your questions. Please. Thank you.
Thank you for a really instructive and I think not entirely unanimous panel, because we have, let's hear it for The Wire, and The Wire is great, and it's wonderful for teaching, and I've taught it, and I agree that it is wonderful for teaching. But then we also have the experience of the class with not very many people of color who are zero people of color.
Of African American origin.
Okay, okay. So that's the problem, and I would say teach it again and get over that. That's their problem.
But it taught me something.
Yes, it did teach you something. I have a friend who says that the problem in America is not that we are, we try to be colorblind, but we can't be colorblind, and we are actually color mute. And that's the paradox. I really appreciate you telling us about that experience. I disagree with the critique of Simon, although I think we should criticize Simon. I think he's not perfect. No. And here, I think what The Wire does by not explicitly targeting race as the problem is that it steps out of a certain paradigm that we have been stuck with, which I've called playing the race card. That we can only speak of racial injury in this way, in which we say, I am black, I have been injured. And then it doesn't seem right, but white people do the same thing. They say, I am white, I am being injured by the new privileges of blacks. And so what The Wire does is it says it goes outside of that, and it can do that because it's serial. It can do that because it goes on and on and on, and it doesn't have to end with the movies in which the black person and the white person become good friends, and the black person really saves the white person. And so I appreciate the fact that it takes the chance to step outside of that framework and, in a sense, not play the race card. So I just would like to hear you all discuss that.
You want to go first?
There's nothing you've said I disagree with. My observation is rather a sort of reflection of the irony that a film that avoids playing the race card becomes kind of monumentalized at a moment when the racial question is exploding. So that points to the inadequacy of a merely textual reading of the show. One would also have to talk about the ways in which it doesn't play the race card and what we can learn from that not playing the race card, because it also, of course, compromises the pedagogical potential of the show. And I think that was my experience, and I'm trying to sort of elaborate on those lessons. Those are not the only lessons one can learn from the show.
And so I guess I'm struggling a little bit because I'm trying to figure out how we're defining what playing the race card means, right? So I'm thinking of a conversation we had in class based off of one scene. With Bubbles, there's a painter, electrician going up the ladder, and Bubbles is going to, and why am I blanking on his partner's name right now? Johnny. Yeah. And they're about to approach this guy and try to basically shake him down for some money. And Johnny says to Bubbles, Bubbles says to Johnny, let me be the person to threaten him so as not to confuse him, right? So implied in that is, we're used to the criminality of black men. So for that, the students, we sort of went off for a while about the understanding of how race and gender, because I think it's very important, works in a way without having to explicitly say it. And so for us, and maybe it's also talks about the composition of the class, those kinds of things where I feel for our students, race is very much at the forefront of the show. And so, the things what makes it so great is that it doesn't constantly say, well, black people this, or African Americans this, because we understand what the challenges are, and it's about how we sort of intersect with those things. And I think that's where I'm sort of, what does playing the race card mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is a direct answer to the issues that you raise, but one of the things I'm struck by always, and your question makes me go back to this, is given how hectoring Simon is in interviews and in his blog, The Audacity of Despair, about issues of race and class and other things, the fact that that the show does not operate that way, I think speaks to his sense of what journalism is for and what narrative is for. And in a narrative as compelling and long as this one is, to not go to moments like that except in a narratively driven way, I think is what captures the imagination of folks like us who want to teach it, who want to watch it, who can't stop thinking and talking about how provocative it is, whether we take that up critically or by being entertained or by being somehow deeply enmeshed in these questions.
Yes, please. If you could come up to the mic. Yes, sir.
Thank you so very much for this very important discussion and review of the work of The Wire, which up until the time that The Wire came on, there has ever been a show such as The Wire, which presented all flavors and colors of the American experience, which particularly because it's a large urban city, Baltimore, reflects some of the lives of the African heritage peoples as well as others as well, and the problems of these cities. No show ever in history has ever done that, and I applaud the Humanities Department and everyone else who have made that possible. I'm a part of a theater group that existed some 40 years ago that's part of what's called the Black Arts Movement. And so we watch this kind of activity as it has progressed and as life as it has progressed from the time that we were doing plays in the 60s. I'm an acolyte and I'm a student of Amiri Baraka when I was 19 years old. I'm a part of the New Lafayette Theater, and we're now reconnoitering to collect and present our archives. So what I see in The Wire and what you all have ingested and start to present is something that hasn't been done before. We have a saying that we always said, our job is to show black people who they are, where they are, and what condition they are in. It's not our job to try to make answers for them. People make a mistake to think that everybody is not thinking and everybody doesn't have a mind of their own. The mind is the most powerful thing there is. So I leave it to you. Once you see, you know. You make your choices about how you do and what you do and how you move within your life in response to what you have seen. And sir, what you said and your relationship to The Wire, and much of which I disagree with, by the way, in your reflection of it. However, that's your choice. You have the choice.
Yours.
And I ask you, how do you compare The Wire with Satyajit Ray?
If you're saying, yes, I mean, Satyajit Ray arises at an early moment in the Indian national experiment, and certainly he's silent on questions of caste difference and caste oppression, and folds them into a kind of imagination of the Bengali middle class. So, I mean, I could draw parallels that, reinforce my argument, but that's not what you'd like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I don't want to take too much time as we finish up this panel because the next panel is so interesting on seriality. But please, sir, let's continue our conversation briefly.
Sorry. I just had one quick question. Out of curiosity, how difficult was it to get buy-in from your respective institutions to be able to use the wire as a visual text for discussing all these bigger issues that are beyond just, Black life in the ghetto, such as sexuality, class, gender issues, business? Just curious.
Well, I like to joke that I'm running a stealth operation. Can you hear me? Is this microphone on? That I'm running a stealth operation, and I've just been very careful to make sure that the content ties into the healthcare curriculum and so on. I think there are, as you would find in any school, a range of views of this is the greatest thing to, I'm not sure everybody's thrilled, because they don't see it as kind of a typical business school course, but my belief is that students are the change agents, and they like the course and it's popular, so I think I kind of feel like I walk a little bit of a fine line, but try to stick to a business outcome, and we've had good outcomes, so thanks.
Our institution, I think, has been a little different. I mean, when we first taught it, Fran was chair of the English department, well, still is, and I was chair of the sociology department, so we did what we wanted. But that being said, when we talked to our colleagues about it, those, whether it be administration or colleagues in our departments, people seemed really excited and interested. Well, how are you guys going to do this? Let us know how that works out for you. I mean, that kind of, those, was sort of, were taken with it. I think they were also daunted by the fact that we were going to have 100 students, and how are we all going to make this work? But we haven't gotten, in this round, everyone's like, ooh, I want to sit. And actually, they did it the first time. People came, colleagues dropped by. We're just going to come in and observe your class because we want to see how this goes. And so I have to say, we've had great support, I think, from the beginning. The challenge is they want us to teach it all the time, and that just hasn't been able to happen. But I think that's the...
Right, and I think I said early on, maybe you weren't here yet, I'm not sure, that it was bureaucratically very simple to do by just putting together two rosters, one from sociology, one from English. But it's also worth noting that we have two TAs who are PhD students in the American Studies program with a class of 100, and that makes it doable as well.
Because they have quite a bit of writing to do in the class, so...
I want to add one thing. I neglected to say that our school's tagline is teaching business with humanity in mind. And I think this course is seen as embodying that.
No, there was no opposition at all. I mean, the surprising thing was that, here was I, a South Asian, never, taught American TV. I was the first to have the idea to teach it in my department, and it was several years after the show ended. So all of that's rather peculiar. But no problem at all otherwise.
Yeah.
We'll take the time for one final question.
It's probably less of a question, more of just a comment from my own experience. I teach criminal procedure and a criminal defense clinic in the Bronx at a law school locally, Pace Law School. And I use the wire for my course to try to acquaint students with matters of policing, particularly in the kind of communities that are depicted in the wire. But one particular episode, well, actually, portion of an episode that I use is where Bubbles calls in a fake tip to Herc, who then does a forcible stop and then a frisk and then a search of the car of the Reverend. And most of my class are white, or certainly not African American. I have a very small number of African American students. But everybody responds to the policing, and even though it turns out along the lines of criminal procedure and the U.S. Supreme Court's rules, everything Herc does is actually okay, right? Because that was probable cause, because Bubbles is a tried and true confidential informant, and so he's allowed to rely on what Bubbles said. He thought it was one of Marlowe's boys, and so he was allowed to do everything he did. But everybody they wanted to throw up. Right, because they saw, first of all, they looked at a reverend, and they were able to pass race and go to his status in the community, and thinking about what it would be like to be a nice old guy like that and get beat up and thrown to the ground. And then they also realized that the rules that they were learning weren't necessarily consistent with their sense of social justice, and that there's something that social justice and the law are not, the same thing. So those lessons could be learned. And in a way, indirectly, they're able to get to more comfortably talking about race through that, because they can talk about the race of the reverend and not feel that they're being confronted in a way that makes them uncomfortable. So what's so rich about The Wire is that there are different parts of The Wire that allow you to do that. One other, and very quickly, another thing is the way the police interrogate D'Angelo Barksdale in the first season, and the way they lie to him and all this pretense. And there is a sympathy for him in spite of the fact that, he's part of the gangsters, but nevertheless, he's a person with soul and is a person with conscience and all that. Again, the students were able to get past the impenetrability of race and see that, again, a lot of the things that the police did in that end up being okay because there's no exclusionary rule when he wasn't ultimately charged. They realized that, again, social justice and the law don't intersect, and they were able to identify. So I think The Wire allows us to do that, and so in a way I'm disagreeing with you too, in that it's how you use it, right? And you can get past that wall.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just to repeat a phrase that you used, sir, to get past the impenetrability of race. I think that nicely summarizes the kind of difficulty or, the paradox that we're wrestling with, which I don't think is purely internal to the text. And so, any reading of the text is legitimate. I mean, as Umberto Eco has said, with any text that is broadcast, misreadings are the rule. There is no possibility of norming the readings of a mass communicated text. The question of how it is worlded, how it plays out in the world, and that's really what I'm trying to comment on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much to the presenters, to the audience, and to The Wire.